Thank you everyone for joining.
So maybe let's start let's do it in the formal way. So we're super pleased to have Christine here. And we learn a lot from her papers and recording and anything. She's a big expert in DeFi. And the topic will be about miners and the BitCoin protocol, which is super relevant after the ETF announcement. Thanks for coming. Good luck. The floor is yours.
Thanks for the invitation. Oh yeah. Okay, thank you for the invitation. This is joint work with Alfred Lehan, who's at the University of Calgary. Okay, so is it possible to move this thing, or that's going to be there, or?
I think it's disappeared.
Oh, there's probably something, but who knows? Okay. So the basic question that we're asking in this paper is just simply, is the Bitcoin protocol, is it efficient? And is it efficient in a very simple way? Is the settlement process that it provides economically efficient for users? Basic question. And the reason why we think that this is interesting, just besides there's a whole bunch of weird institutional detail that's just really fun about this stuff, is we're kind of interested in this because arguably there have been other experiments in DeFi, but this is a proof of concept of a decentralized or digital system that's been going since 2008, whatever. And so, yeah, it seems pretty successful. So does it work? The other thing, sorry. Oh, okay, thank you. All right. The other thing is, as I'm sure you all read with great interest yesterday, the SEC has finally agreed to ETF, a Bitcoin ETF. And once you have a Bitcoin ETF, you're going to have lots of people buying and selling Bitcoin on traditional exchanges that are going to be now exposed to this. So we kind of want to know a little bit about how it works. In other countries, so in Canada, there's actually been there are crypto ETFs that have been going around for a lot longer. So in other countries, this is not so unusual. In Germany, you can buy crypto products through your bank. But in the US, this is sort of a step forward. So we'll see where it goes. Finally, the reason why we find this interesting is because there's this sort of question about how to reach consensus on a distributed ledger. Proof of work is one way. People sort of focus on the sort of mining and whether or not, it uses too many resources. We're just interested in essentially saying, okay, how do we want to think about this in a sort of economicsy kind of a way? I mean, we're finance people, but we kind of try to be economicsy occasionally. So what is Bitcoin? Bitcoin is a digital asset. I really am completely agnostic about what the source of value is and why anyone would want to hold it. So I'm just thinking about it as an asset, a tradable asset. And the way it works is the value, whatever you think that might be, is transferred peer-to-peer, and you're basically sending information from one wallet to another. So you're sending information from one address to another. Fine. In this process, the transactions that people want to make, so the hypothetical transactions, are basically publicly broadcast to the system. So you see that A wants to send stuff to B. And the actual transfer happens because a group of people called, quote unquote, miners, they pick a set of those pending transactions and they actually make them happen, right? And the process is called miners are the people who do it. The process is called mining. Got nothing to do with miners or mining, but that's just the language that people use. And essentially what the miners do is they append the information that value has been transferred from A to B to a block, and it's a piece of information that's just sitting out there that anyone can observe. And so the very specific question that we're looking at is, does this system work? Is the Bitcoin system effective? Going to be a little bit more precise about what that means. Just at settling transactions, moving information from A to B. Does it work? Okay. So a bit more detail about how it specifically works. So there's something called a hash function. And basically, it's something where the output of this function, so you put a whole bunch of data into the function, the output is always of the same size, standardized size, and it goes in one direction in the sense that it's pretty easy to calculate the output of a hash function, but once you have the output, it's really difficult to figure out what the inputs are, right? And the mining process, which is sort of going to be what we're thinking about, the incentives of miners, basically uses one of these functions. And what they do is they find a random number that has the property that if you combine the random number with a whole bunch of listed transactions that want to process, the output of that goes through the hash process has the correct number of leading zeros, right? So essentially what they're doing is they're just finding random numbers. And this is why people have criticized the process. This is why people talk about, the energy usage and all these sorts of other things, because they're just like spitting out random numbers. And when people think about different miners competing to get blocks, to mine blocks, basically competition in this world is essentially whether or not I am faster than the next person at finding this random number. So it all comes down to how quickly I can generate random numbers, plug them into this hash function, generate the output. That's basically all I'm doing. So the person who does that faster basically has an advantage, and that's kind of what people are trying to do. And so people talk about hash rates. That's the rate at which I can generate this random number, crank it through a bit of information, come out with the output. And if my hash rate is higher, I can do that faster than you. So that's what competition looks like in this world. Does everyone know this already? Oh, please.
Do they get kickback?
Oh, yeah. No, it's not related to the transaction. We're getting to that in a bit. Yeah. Okay. Compensation for miners. A pertinent questioner might ask, what is the compensation? Okay, so there are two types of compensation that the miners get. One is called the coin base. There's a lot of lingo in this world. It doesn't really matter. It's just like basically a flat fee. And this is if you manage to find the number first, right? The hash function, and you get the random number that has the right number of leading zeros. You basically, and you tell everyone that you've got it, you basically programmatically get this flat cash amount, which they call the coin base. And the coin base is paid out in Bitcoin. And so this is how new Bitcoin come into the world. You've heard people talking about Bitcoin is having a limited supply, and it's basically this. The new Bitcoin come into the world through this process, and the number of Bitcoin that come into the world through this process declines over time programmatically. So it was originally set at about 50, and now it's, I think it's less than this now, but it's cut in half. Oh, it's much less than this now, but it's cut in half about every certain number of blocks, right? And essentially, the whole idea is that the price of Bitcoin is going to move in such a way, it's going to become more and more difficult to find this random number because the number of leading zeros is going to increase. And so there's going to be some equilibrium notion in the background. That's sort of how it's designed. Now, the other type of remuneration that miners get are what are known as fees. So the fees is stuff that is offered by agents essentially as an incentive to be included in a block earlier rather than later. So I said that what miners are doing is they are picking up pending transactions or transactions that people want to have go through, and then finding a random number and going on with their lives. The people whose transactions are pending, if they want to get a transaction through more rapidly, have an incentive, presumably, to bid a higher fee, to basically say, look, I'm willing to pay more, include me earlier, right? And so fees are voluntary. They're offered by people who are waiting to have their transactions processed, and miners can choose to pick up these fees or not. Please.
It works like an auction, like the higher you bid, and the higher chance you get to be first in the block.
No. And we're going to talk about that. Because, I mean, with auctions, there's a set of rules. This is a first price auction, it's a second price auction, blah, 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 blah. Miners can choose whatever they want to put in a block. So there's nothing pre-specified in the protocol that says it has to be organized in a particular, under a particular format. Right? So, I'll say it again.
So the question is, so the customers offer and someone is to accept them,
That's right, yeah.
and is there any good reason to not accept the highest fee or the lowest fee? Now I'm not.
That's where we're going. That's where we're going. Okay. Okay. So I said miners, and usually when they're described, they're people with laptops in their basements. This is an industry. How does it work? Basically, people with a lot of money and not much expertise, perhaps, go out and they buy specialized mining rigs. They will sign long-term contracts with, the Texas Power Authority. They will set up mining shops, and they'll have computer banks and banks and banks and banks of computers that are basically have the specialized chips that you need to do these hash functions at high speed. They then write contracts with overarching bodies, and the overarching bodies basically design the sort of optimal way of searching for the random number that's gonna solve the problem, right? The point that I'm trying to make here is that this is a large industry with a large but finite number of pools that are basically these agglomeration of miners. The daily revenue is about $27 million. It obviously fluctuates depending on what the Bitcoin price is. And typically the people who are mining, you should think of them as large companies. Right? These are, some of them are publicly traded, right? They're not really open about the fact that they have a Bitcoin mining operation, but they typically do, right? Or some of them do. Okay. So what is the sort of question a little bit more in detail about this? So what the Bitcoin miners are providing an economic service, which is settlement. Right? They haven't set up a market. They haven't done anything like that. What they're doing is just providing economic settlement. And typically when you read the literature around Bitcoin systems, everyone describes them as being competitive. And essentially what we're doing is we're saying, are they competitive? Do they work the way we think competitive industries work? And the answer is, I'm going to come up with is no. But we're going to sort of walk through why that might be the case. And what's going to be really key, and I'm going to repeat this again and again, so just get used to it, is, in this industry, winning or basically processing transactions only happens if you have the highest hash rate, right? when we think about competition, we think about free entry. We think about maybe having a better product. We think about all these different things. So what's going on there? Basically, I can come in and I can increase my market share by selling more products, maybe at a slightly lower price. In the Bitcoin protocol, you can't do that. You can only basically increase your market share by having a higher hash rate. You cannot sort of agree in any kind of way to provide this product at a lower price. You can only basically have a bigger machine, right? Okay. So what do? We basically look at all the realized transactions on the blockchain, and we look at different things. We look at block usage, and we look at how many fees were paid. We also try to get a proxy for the latent demand, which is the transactions that haven't happened, that are just sitting around and waiting. And the way we do that is we have, Alfred, found some guy in Austria who's collected a time series, and we got it, or Alfred did. And the second thing that we do, at some point, we got our own node, and we just watched and sort of listened and watched. And every time somebody said, oh, look, I want a transaction, we recorded that. So we could sort of see people coming in, waiting to be settled, and then we could see the ex post settlement on the Bitcoin blockchain itself. Okay. And we just do some pretty basic stuff. We just look at what happens in the system compared to what we sort of think intuitively is competitive, like lowest price for consumers, everything working efficiently. And essentially what we think we see is what looks like strategic capacity management. These guys are not processing the maximal amount of transactions that they could, and they're doing it because they want to essentially extract more fees. And we provide a rough proxy for how much they've extracted in excess of what we think people would be willing to pay or for congestion costs, right? Okay. So a bit more detail on the data. The stuff that I'm going to present is basically blocks between January 3, 2009 and November 9th, 2021, where we've updated it to about 3 months ago, but everything takes a long time to rerun and redo all the things. But everything seems to be going through, everything is going through so far. So for every block, we see the Coinbase. At the time we did this draft, it was around 6 Bitcoin. And we look at all the transactions. And a transaction is usually an address from and to. And if the amount taken from is not the amount to, the difference between that are fees that basically the person who mines the block can then put them direct to themselves, okay? There are quite a few transactions. I think that's really big, but I was talking to somebody in microstructure, or basically they say it's tiny. Okay, fine. But, you know, it's pretty robust, I think. And we also can see how big transactions are. Measuring how big things are actually is a little bit complicated. There were different, there have been system changes that essentially changed the way data was stored in each of the blocks. That mean blocks are more or less efficient to put into a block, so their effective size differs. I'm not going to get into those details, but I'm going to use the word weight, and you should think of that as just how big things are, right? Okay. So the other data set, I said we had potential transactions. We have the first the first bit is this partially aggregated mempool data, and it includes the number and size of transactions, and it's based on 45 different fee buckets. So they're sort of lumped together. And the snapshots are every minute from December 16th to the end of our sample. And then we have these complete nodes that basically allow us to track in much more detail when transactions enter the mempool, dependencies, so we can make sure that everything we're doing is robust. We can look at when they're mined. And so basically we can trace everything in much more detail than we can in the sort of aggregated. Okay. Any questions about any of this so far? Okay. So as far as we know in the economics and finance literature, mostly finance, there are two papers that sort of look at fees. There's work by Easley O'Hara and Bazu, and then Huberman, Leshno, and Malomi. That came out in Restud. And both of these, they have a slightly different perspective. The Easley O'Hara and Bazu, they're basically thinking about long-term entry and resilience of the system. These guys are doing a queuing model where basically people will pay different fees because they're worried about congestion. There's sort of a risk associated with congestion. Both of these papers in the background have the idea that all blocks are full. They basically have the idea that miners are essentially just machines that are automatically processing transactions, right? So that seems to be the way that people are thinking about it. Another way of saying that is that both of these sort of papers are in a world where miners are completely competitive. They just sort of myopically do transactions and they take the highest ones first. Okay. Just a sort of quick thing about, or comment about capacity. I mentioned we use the word weight. So each block in the Bitcoin blockchain has a fixed capacity, right? And there have been some changes in the capacity. There were, sort of different ways of organizing the information, which essentially roughly changed the capacity. We take this into account, and we're just sort of pushing that under the table, right? Okay. Okay. Everyone's okay? There are bizarrely few questions, but okay, all right. So how are we thinking about this? Think about a world where agents have essentially a difference in utility for consummated trades. So there's some people who really want to have their trade consummated and want to have it consummated quickly, and there's some people who are willing to wait, roughly speaking. And let's suppose that some people get their utility only if their transaction is consummated within a different time period. So people who are going to have high valuations for trade want to have it done right now in this block. People with lower ones are willing to wait, right? And let's suppose that agents have some sort of idea or beliefs about how fees affect transaction speed, right? So you could think that if you bid high, it's going to go really quickly, or you could think if you bid low, it's going to go quickly. They have beliefs, right? And once agents put in an order in this system, they can't revisit the order or change it, and it's sort of just floating around, right? And miners have complete discretion over what they include in blocks, right? It's their choice. Now,
So the beliefs can be either that it's competitive market and then the higher I beat, the chances are higher. But I also can think that there is monopolies, that the miners are monopoly, and then it's not necessary that the higher my beat, I will get to.
Yes, I mean, I'm not going to work out a complete model because, as I mentioned, we're sort of in between. I'm in a world where agents have a sense that there's a mapping between fees and how fast it's done. Yes, absolutely. Okay. Please.
Because you can actually up your bid on BitCoin. I can resubmit the same transaction, the higher fee, it will get settled first, and it will simply make the other transaction, which you're right, it's still technically floating in the mental, but it will make it impact.
Yes. Okay. When we actually look at the mempool data, we can look at those conditional orders and sort of see how they affect our results. And we're okay with that. I mean, it doesn't, yeah, but thank you. Dalia knows like 500 times more than I do about this, so I'm just hoping I can survive. Okay. So what would we expect from competition, right? Well, I mean, just like as a first pass, if somebody said, oh, it's a competitive system, what would I think? Well, the first thing I would ask is, well, how many people are waiting? Are people waiting? Is there a capacity constraint? What's going on? And so if I'm told that there's a huge number of people who are waiting to be processed, I would say, well, I'd expect every single block to be full, right? If there are people who want to have their orders processed and they're willing to pay, it should be full. And also, I'd kind of expect that if you have something with a really high fee that's sitting in the mempool, a latent sort of order, I wouldn't expect that to wait or to, for another order to go first, right? Just sort of two things I'd expect. So what is just sort of like looking at pictures? What does it tell us? This gives you block capacity usage, and this is over the sample. And this is averaged across the day. The blue line is average usage, so it goes between 0 and 1. The red is full blocks, so these are 100% full. And the orange are empty blocks. I think I've got that right. Yeah. Okay. So what do we see from this? Well, we see that occasionally you get empty blocks being processed, completely empty, right? So what do we think is going on? Well, kind of in the early days, you'd kind of think, oh, there's probably not much demand, right? Later on, you still see some empty blocks, not very many. And you'd think, oh, that's a little bit odd. Could be technical glitch. Fine. Okay. What you also see is you see, you can either look at the full or the average usage. Basically, you get average usage that is certainly increasing over time, but basically it doesn't hit at 100%. So what is that telling you? That's basically telling you that you're getting blocks being mined, consistently being mined at less than full capacity. Yeah.
What is the average reward from fees versus BitCoin, the project?
So we don't have a graph, right, of that. Over time, because the Coinbase is getting smaller and smaller and smaller, the importance of, sorry? Yeah, but the value of fees is going up, right? So we know at some point the Coinbase is going to dwindle to 0, and the fees are going to be the only thing that's driving the system.
Do you have any ballpark idea of what's the space right now? If I look at a typical, it's an average block on BitCoin.
I could guess, but that would be totally inaccurate, I would suspect. But the fees are going to be lower than the Coinbase for sure. So like 20% or so. Yeah. Okay. what else do I want to say about this? Yeah, so when we're talking about full blocks, we're essentially talking about blocks that are full-ish. Because there could potentially be a rounding error on the size of transactions and the size defined in terms of computer size. Essentially, we allow, we take into account that maybe there was some sort of almost integer problem. And so we're kind of very flexible in our definitions. Okay. So, a nice picture. The question is, is this big or is this small? Well, one way to look at it is just to say how many transactions weren't settled, didn't go through. And on average, if you look at about from 2014, and we choose 2014 because that's when we think the mempool started to be, the latent demand was always larger than the block capacity. Basically, there's space for about 184,000 transactions per day. So these are sort of sitting around. And, is this a lot? Well, you can sort of calculate how much more fee revenue could be obtained by taking each block, filling it up with the orders that we think are sitting around in the mempool, and calculating, because we have these buckets, 45 buckets, we could say, okay, so if they're at that fee level and we put them in the block, how much more money could you have made? So we do that calculation. Yeah.
I keep asking because you complain that it's 15 questions. But have you looked at how long it would take to validate the signatures on the connections, and thereby lose some competitive advantage because we're not solving the puzzle while validating?
So we sort of went backwards and forwards on this, and the large mining pools have like they have this system called fiber, which basically allows them to do like very, very high speed validation, and they do it when it comes into the mempool. So it's not a case of, oh, I'm now going to mine a new block and I sort of look and I check everything. It's checked as it goes into the mempool. So we think that, the speeds are very, very low.
You have to validate at the latest state of the ledger.
Yeah.
I'm not sure it's that. Yeah, it depends on how full the block. But anyway, that's something to be imagined.
Yeah. But also, but then we come into a discussion about magnitudes, right? And then that's something that economists can sort of talk about. All right. Yeah, Nir.
I can get the economics intuition that if I am the only miner, so maybe I want to ignore some low fees transaction because they maybe push users to pay higher fee in the next block. And however, in Bitcoin, because maybe I get it wrong, it's not like Ethereum that sometimes you want to ignore a high fee transaction because you can manipulate DeFi application to get a revenue, and you want to do it instead of the one that's going to execute the transaction. What is the logic to ignore high fee transaction as a miner?
The argument that I'm going to make is, you think that's high? I want higher. You right? Yeah, yeah. And effectively, what we think they're doing is they're using this sort of capacity management as a threat.
So maybe like the way I can think is that they think that in each individual trader maybe not really monitoring what's going in the mining pool. So they want to send to this individual trader that bid $10 fee. We want more money. So with your transaction is waiting, next time you more, and we know that you are a big trader, so you want to do 1 million transaction in Bitcoin, so you are more likely to pay more fees.
I mean, alternatively, you can think about everyone being small, close to atomistic, and essentially optimally putting their transactions through, given their beliefs about how the system works. If everyone thinks that there's a menu, and you then decide what you want to eat off the menu, right? Right. Okay. So this is sort of the excess capacity. How much money is it? So this is our calculation of daily money left on the table. Right? There are two things here. There's the Bitcoin price in US dollars. That's the sort of the lighter color. And the darker color is sort of money left on the table. Right? Is it a lot of money? You know, it goes between, let's say, around, you know, like 100,000 to 400,000 a day. I don't.
Just because I don't know anything about this, that's what's left on the table, what was actually transacted, like what fraction is left on the table?
So the ballpark transactions you could come about with this. So they're leaving about, you know, sort of, I don't know if you draw a straight line there or so, like they're about 85 to 100% full. So there's about 15% floating around. I mean, that's like just eyeballing. Yeah. Eyeball logic with somebody whose glasses are on their heads is probably not a good thing to take truth, but okay, let's go with it. All right, so let's sort of think about what miners' incentives might be. Well, unlike standard competitive environments, my market share only depends on how big my machines are. They don't really depend on which orders I take, right? It's not as if I'm setting a price and the lower price is going to get a higher market share. It doesn't work that way. Customers also cannot choose the miner. And so the miner can't do anything that we usually think of as being increasing quality in consumer markets, right? They just don't have that lever. And the other thing to think about is that if you're really, really big, you're more likely to be able to successfully mine a block right now, but you're also much more likely to affect what the history of mining has been. Because you're a big player, you do it more often, and so everyone sees you, and so you've sort of affected the history that everyone sees. So big miners have a really big incentive to make sure that everyone understands the way they think the mining system should work. Okay, so let's just sort of think through a little bit how a consumer might approach this problem. So let's suppose that every period, 3 new transactions arrive at the mempool. So every period, I've got a high, a medium, and a low guy, and that's at T0, T1, and T2. Okay? The second column, or the third column, is just the timestamp when it comes in. So if you're in a world where transactions are processed as they arrive, what's going to happen? Well, if transactions are processed as they arrive, then you're going to get in the block right after this timestamp 0, you're going to get 3 transactions go through. In the second block, you're going to get 3 transactions going through. And in the third block, you're going to get 3 transactions going through, all high, medium, and low. And just think about what you would bid if you were in this world. If you were in this world and you had to submit a fee with your order, what are you going to do? Well, you know that your order is just going to be processed because that's what miners do. They're machines that just sort of process these things. So what you're going to do is essentially bid 0, right? If you're not worried about, you know, rationing, if you're not worried about anything like this, if you're not worried about capacity constraints, the optimal thing to do is just to put in a 0 fee. If the miner is just behaving myopically and translating everything through, right? Right? So, is that what we think are happening? Well, we saw that there was excess capacity, and we think that there's excess demand for transactions that aren't going through. So what's going on? And so we think that what miners are doing is they're strategically increasing waiting times to induce higher bids. And effectively what they're doing is they're taking into account that they're more likely to have affected the history. They're going to be mining in the future, so they want everyone to submit the highest possible bids. And implicitly what they're doing is they're offering agents just a menu of fees and processing times. And this is only going to be rational if you've mined a block today and you think you're going to mine a block tomorrow because you're going to benefit from it. Right? So, you know, what would happen if there is a menu like this? Well, if there was a menu like this, in our world where there are 3 different types that are arriving, what's going to happen? Well, the guy who wants to execute immediately is going to pay the high fee. And sure enough, they're going to get processed, right? The ones who pay the sort of middling fee, they've got a slightly longer delay time, let's suppose 1 block, and suppose that the lowest guys have to wait for 2 blocks. So you're going to see various patterns in the data if this is what people believe. You're going to see the really high fees going first. Kind of expect that. Okay. But you're also going to see excess capacity. So in this case, they're imposing waiting times on one of the middle fees. So you're going to see excess capacity. And the other thing that you're going to see is you're going to see some low fees that are executed when some middling fees are still waiting. You're going to see essentially what we call priority violations. You're not going to see high fees going through first. You're going to see some low fees going through before other fees, essentially because people want to impose the correct waiting times on those who are in the mempool. Right? Questions about this, please?
What's the difference between the shortest waiting time and the longest waiting time?
Technically, the longest waiting time could be infinite because, yeah, some people get sort of kicked out of the system, so mempools get flushed. The shortest waiting time would be somewhere under 10 minutes.
But then what's a reasonable, like, let's say it's a long waiting time? Are you talking like days or, aside from infinite, let's ignore the infinite.
Yeah. We haven't calibrated this. One could do that, but we haven't done it, partially because the model is still a mess, but yeah, okay. The other thing that we do is we look at people, we try to get a sense of differences in fees that more desperate people would be more willing to pay by essentially looking at people who we think are doing financial transactions. And they seem to be paying higher fees, so it's sort of consistent, but we don't have a time estimate.
Is it profit maximizing to essentially do priority violation?
Well, one shot, no. Intertemporally, yes. I mean, that's the argument we're making. So in this world, it's got to be, yeah. Because if in this world where you're just mining everything, basically people's optimal bid is going to be 0, right? In this world, people are going to be bidding closer to their valuation. If you think about the high value guy really being worried about waiting and having a loss if they wait, then they're going to want to basically bid high. And of
You say, I would not process any transaction with a fee over
so what you're looking for is what is the optimal pricing mechanism. We don't have an answer for that. Yeah. We're having enough arguments with people about the fact that it might not be competitive. Yeah. But sorry, if there was if there was a fees have to be higher, if there's like a reserve fee, you might want to have that be time varying depending on times of day and demand conditions. And there are all sorts of sort of cognitive reasons why that might just be really complicated. I mean, I don't know if that answers your question in any way. Yeah, please.
So in your analysis, a shift over the years, probably around in sophistication of miners. Before that, they might have taken, first everything they saw, and later they started.
Yeah, we try and look and see whether or not mining concentration exacerbates any of the effects that we see, and mining concentration does. Yeah, and all this action happened in 2016. Yeah, about 2016 is right. Yeah.
There's two comments, not questions. One is there's an analysis by Sabari and Ayal, two technical researchers.
Mhm.
Around,
Yeah,
it's called gapping.
I haven't seen it.
So, synthetically, in an ideal world where fees have no upper limit, they can go to infinity.
Yeah.
We could show that the optimal strategy for miners is to never fund. Keep waiting, and the fees will go high.
That sounds like a Technion result. Yeah. Okay.
Two things, perhaps, I have to take into account, with analyzing. First of all, when you start mining, there is a cost. It's not,
I agree.
so
Yeah.
you start mining now, and then as the transaction comes and you switch to it,
Yeah.
you pay the electricity, you pay OpEx.
Agree. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And that has to factor into the analysis. The second thing is there could be off-chain contracts.
Absolutely. Yes. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Large.
Yeah, yeah. Which we know they do. Yeah. 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 But I don't think you can make enough money to keep your mining rig going by just having the large fees. You're going to want to have some of these guys as well. Actually, this goes to your reserve price question. So the sort of OTC market for mining for very, very large transactions would sort of, I mean, it'll look a little bit more like that, right? And then that's much more like a take it or leave it offer and, whatever. Okay. Just as a sort of how to think about this. This is a screenshot from a Bitcoin mining calculator. These are all over, you can find them, lots of them. And basically, what they do is they allow you to say, okay, I want to confirm within how many blocks, how much do I actually have to put in, given what the current state of the system is. We tried to figure out who was actually behind these websites, and we couldn't quite do it. But, if I was going to put a menu, I would certainly do something like this, right? Just make it very easy for people to understand what the system was. But so there's definitely the sense that if you want to get Bitcoin calculated, or if you want to get Bitcoin processed, you kind of want to the sort of the fee levels are sort of out there. Okay. Strategic capacity management. Yeah, lots of people have written about this in a different context. So it's all about consumer entry. they're durable good monopolists. This is actually closest to a durable good monopolist in the sense that you're providing settlements to the same distribution of people next period. And so that looks a lot like, conceptually, it's very, very similar. There's some ideas that rationing can accelerate purchases. The operations research stuff do this. There's a paper from guys at Carnegie Mellon, I think in the marketing group, that basically say the miners change capacity to sort of drive out the extensive margin, which is a similar, it's a related but different argument. Okay. So one of the Bitcoin, anyone can join the Bitcoin system. It's very, very easy to be part of it. And so the question is, is there free entry? Should we think about this as free entry? Well, at the really low end, mining rigs will cost about 1K. That's super cheap. The chances of you winning a block, if you're running on something that costs 1K, is minuscule. It's tiny, right? So you put this investment in and you wouldn't see anything for very long periods of time, right? Your relative hash rate would be really low. One way that you could increase that would be to sign up with a mining pool, and you might get a reasonable stream of profits. But at that point, you're basically no longer making the decision about which fees to pick up. Somebody else is making that decision. It's centralized. So I would argue there are actually really high barriers to entry in this market. Was there a question at the back?
Mining is inherently linear. To some approximation, if I get 1,000 of 1/1,000 of the mining power, I will win 1/1,000 of the mining reward. There's no competition, there's no economy, there's no market.
Exactly, yes, I agree.
I glossed over a little bit because there is some constant cost that you pay no matter how much.
Yeah. But let's just say they're not. Yeah. I agree. But the thing is, so I pay $1,000, and usually if I'm setting up a local store, I pay $1,000 and I'll be able to sell something right now. But as you say, if you pay, if you have 1/1,000th of the hashing power, you're going to have to wait for 1,000 blocks to get one, right? And so basically, what is the cost for mining one block would be one way of thinking about it. Much, much higher than just the fixed cost of buying one rig. That's sort of how I'm thinking about it.
1,000 blocks doesn't take that long. It's not even a day, it's hours, right?
Yeah, but it magnifies essentially what the cost of entry is.
Right.
Does everyone agree with me on this, or no? Or
You're scientists against a room full of economists, but it is.
yeah, no, but I agree. But because agree.
More or less identical that any fraction of the cost of mining, cost in terms of hardware and electricity.
Yeah.
What the reward is.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I decide to bet 1,000 or 1.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
the reward of the day.
Yeah.
How long I have to wait? Not that long. It's actually a pretty fast.
Yeah.
Setting up a store, a flower store, getting my brand.
Yeah.
marketed and all that would take much longer.
But I guess the point that I'm making is this investment does not allow you to immediately enter and compete in the market. It allows you to compete at a certain rate. And you should take that rate into account when you're thinking about how costly it is to enter.
Not a zero-sum game. I just
Mhm.
want some reward, and it's a profitable business, and it will give me a yield proportional to my investment.
Yeah, but the point that I just want to make here is that the fixed cost is, I don't think is negligible, right? right? Somebody has to, you know, I put it on my credit card, right? Okay. So a reasonable computer scientist would say that everything is linear. So a question then, so the question would be, well, if it's really easy to enter, would people just come in and not do anything like this, just like take the highest fees and keep on going? So what we're doing here is we're looking at the essentially fees collected by entrants relative to established pools, right? So we're trying to understand if people coming in behave differently than people who are sitting in the market. And basically, when people first come in, they are essentially they're essentially scooping up way more fees than the people who are existing in the market, right? But then this sort of drifts down over time, right? This so it is a ratio, and I have no idea. I'm not exactly sure how we calculated that. Yeah, good question. Well, we got many negative numbers too here. I have to check this. Okay. You know, modulo calculations. This is block weight of entrants relative to established pools. And they're also starting to restrict capacity. No idea. What we think they're doing is they're just trying to essentially they're doing some sort of machine learning or whatever you want, basically saying, okay, what is the optimal strategy for putting together blocks? And they're learning over time that restricting capacity is the way to go. Okay, okay, so what can we sort of think through on the data? If this is strategic, then it's got to be the case that I'm strategic because I'm going to benefit in the future. That means that there's going to be a limited number of people who are participating, right? And so the more concentrated mining capacity is, the more you're going to see this sort of strategic capacity management, right? And essentially, you know, if the probability of mining a block in the future is really small, you're just going to want to take the highest fees first. At some point, you're going to behave almost myopically. So what we do is we compare a concentration measure just by backward looking at how many blocks they mine on a daily basis. And we basically look at how that affects various variables that we might be interested in. So it turns out that if you look at fee dispersion, essentially between high-low quantiles, this increases in how in the market concentration measure, right? So the argument is, as you have a more as you have more concentration, they're more able to do the strategic capacity management, which means that you're more likely to get close to a menu, right?
Can I ask about exit? So these miners leave this market. How do I think about it? I guess I'm thinking about your graphs and whether some of that was selection out of the market, and I'm trying to, but I don't know the market. So like do miners quit?
So miners do quit. So there were quite a few miners who quit in China, as an example. What happens? They sell their mining rigs to other people, and the mining pools continue. So those graphs were based on mining pools. The number of miners who are in those mining pools will fluctuate over time. So it's really difficult in the sense that there's not an incorporated mining, firm and it stays the same size. It's an umbrella. I'm tracking the umbrella and the computing capacity at the umbrella level. Yeah. Okay. So here we're looking at the fee spread per block, and we're looking at the HHI, and this sort of affects the fee spread. Right? What do I want to look at here? I've got another 10 minutes. Is that right? Ish? Yeah. Okay. So another thing that we look at is time between blocks. The time between blocks is actually a random variable. Why? Because they're finding a random variable, so there's going to be a distribution associated with it, right? So some blocks are really close together, and some blocks are really, really far apart. And that's just because they're trying to find this magic number. Now, if you think about a world where people are trying to impose weighting costs on people who are sitting in the mempool, right? If blocks are really, really far apart, what you're going to be doing, you've already sort of imposed that weighting cost on people, right? Versus if blocks are really close together, you haven't imposed a weighting cost. So in a world in which there's just a sort of a random picking out of people from the mempool, this time between blocks should have absolutely no effect on what the things that are processed. So this is what we observed. Yeah, it's supposed to be concentrated around 10 minutes. Okay. So essentially, if there's this strategic capacity management, right? Then, the strategic capacity management should be more pronounced if mining is more concentrated. So we look at block weight, so how much is processed. We look at, on the dummies of the terciles of the distribution of the number of blocks mined in the last hour, right? And it turns out the effect is larger if mining is more concentrated, right? Okay. What do I want to do? I want to go here. Okay. So what kind of argument have I made so far? I've made the argument that unused capacity or strategic capacity management can be used to price discriminate, basically, to force people to bid higher. Mining pools can implement this with either empty blocks or partially full blocks. All of this stuff is going to increase costs to the consumer. So what we can do is basically say, okay, we think that they're doing this. So let's just look at the fees that people pay, and we'll look at the sort of top portion of fees, and just say that those are excess fees that came about because of this strategic capacity management, right? We played around. We picked the 25th percentile. But we played around with sort of different measures, and we get the same thing. Right? Okay. Basically, in terms of whether or not we think this is sort of economically meaningful, over our sample, this is the sum of all fees paid in the transactions. I mean, they sort of add up, right? What we call the excessive fees is basically also pretty big, okay? And these are things that we think have been generated because of this strategic capacity management. Okay, so how do we want to think about this? We think that there's collusion, or what we call collusion. So if you think about standard oligopoly, there's this trade-off between one-shot deviation against long-term punishment. So how do you want to think about, that kind of incentive compatibility constraint in this world? One-shot deviation is basically just to fill up my block up to the max. That's only so big, and that's only so much money. So basically, that's actually not very profitable. Long-term, what kind of punishment strategies could you possibly have? Punishment strategies aren't particularly effective, right? You can't sort of punish by changing your price the way you can in standard sort of oligopoly stuff, because the fees are set by consumers. The only way that you could punish is, well, I mean, it's difficult to see how you could possibly punish, right? And so, what do we think? Basically, once miners are all sufficiently large that they think that they're going to come to the market again and again and again, they have this incentive to do this strategic capacity management. And if all miners are sufficiently large that they think that they're going to come back in the future, they have the same incentive, essentially, to ensure that fees are high, because when it's their turn to mine a block, they're going to get it. And we think that this is sort of an economic constraint that isn't really factored into the system. And we think that basically quite a bit of consumer value has been lost through this, just because the system is designed essentially to align all the large miners' incentives. And that might not be a good thing if you want competition.